joined by Dr. Theresa Tobin and Dr. Dawne Moon, both professors at Marquette University. Dr. Tobin is a professor, ethicist, former professor of mine, actually, and Dr. Moon is a sociologist. And they both work together on a topic that Randy and I have been discussing for probably a year or more, and that is the contentious issue of LGBT people in the church, particularly conservative Christian churches. And you guys have written several papers together on this. I understand maybe there's a book in the works that I would like to hear about if you're willing to tell us about that. So thank you guys so much for joining us.
Yeah, welcome.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Cool. So why don't we get started by you just tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you got started working together on this topic, how specifically, what's it like having a philosopher and a sociologist collaborate on something like this, and what kind of dynamic does that bring to this topic? Does that make it better? There must have been a reason you guys decided to collaborate. So how did that all go?
Money, actually. Yeah. So I've been studying Christian debates about sexuality in the US since the 90s. Oh. And an opportunity came up to apply for a grant that was calling for an interdisciplinary team. That project had to be led by at least one person in the social sciences and one person in the humanities. And I had met Theresa one time, right? Mm-hmm, someone else, a colleague of ours, was like, "You two should talk to each other sometime." And we had coffee, and I was like, who could I work with on this? And I was like, maybe that Theresa person. And like, she was on leave, and it was, I didn't know if it was going to happen or not. I didn't know what was going to happen, but we started talking about it, and it seemed like a good idea. And as we were working on the application for this grant, we realized that our work really spoke to our projects really spoke to each other really well and resonated really well. I don't know, maybe you have other insights about that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And just to add some detail, I was on parental leave with 3-month newborn twins when I got her email. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I think I was holding both of them sitting in this chair in my living room. And I remember thinking like, oh, yes, I have to do this, but how am I going to do this? But I did it. I was like, I absolutely want to do this. And so glad that I did. It's been life-changing and I think career-changing. And I come to this too, considering myself a survivor of what I now call spiritual violence. And so for me, the work that we were doing together in the explorations and learning with Dawne and from Dawne about the work she had already done and how it was converging with work I wanted to do more of was also very, it just felt like a personally really important work to do too. So for me, personal and professional really coming together in an exciting opportunity that, it's been the best research thing I've done since I got all this started. So
Theresa, you said that you're a survivor of spiritual
violence.
Describe spiritual for us.
Yeah. So I use that term to name the way that religious communities, and in particular for me, Christian communities, I'm Catholic, use religion, use faith formation to make people think that God despises them, or God wants them to suffer, or God thinks they're inferior. So use religion to draw people away from God and God's expansive love for them, rather than drawing people toward God and toward healthy relationship. So ways that people use religion to do that. And I came across the term for the first time in 2010, I think. A columnist for the National Catholic Reporter named Jamie Manson was writing about some recent Vatican teachings that were about women, and she used the term, and it just really resonated with my own experiences. And then in talking with Dawne, realizing that she had been researching and thinking about a phenomenon that we both came to see was another form of spiritual violence. So
you were a victim of spiritual violence, but you stayed in, you said you're Catholic. You stayed in.
I am. Yeah.
That's quite a thing.
Yep. Ongoing. Yep. open, but
Okay.
yes, still, still really important part of who I understand myself to be.
It's remarkable. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how did the emphasis on LGBTQ Christians come up?
Well, that is what I've been studying kind of all along. I mean, other things too, but when I was in graduate school, I was trying to figure out what am I going to write my dissertation on. It was going to have to be something that was rewarding in itself to me. That was what I was thinking about anyway, because there's not necessarily a job at the end of graduate school, and what I was thinking about was homophobia, and so I was trying, I was like, where are people really talking about it and not just like spitting sound bites out? And so then I realized that was churches. And, it took me a few months of doing participant observation in a church to realize like, oh, I'm studying religion. And I had to like, kind of really get caught up. I'm like, what is all this about? And, for me, it's really about people trying to figure out how to live life and what life is about and what their purpose is. And, so, people do that explicitly in religious communities, but, everybody's doing it in some way or other for the most part. And I had studied in the 90s, I'd studied debates within the Methodist Church, which was, and still is actually, very much split down the middle, with half really moving in an embracing and affirming direction, and the other half saying like, that is not where we should be going. And then in I think 2012, 2013, because a family member who grew up evangelical was in the process of coming out as gay, I realized that there's this whole conversation going on among evangelicals. And I was like, this is what I have been working toward. Like, I didn't know it, but this is really where everything that I'm interested in comes together. And so just like trying to figure out what is going on in this movement, what are the dynamics within evangelical and fundamentalist churches, was just like, zoop, this is what I have to do. And it's amazing the work that's going on and that people are doing.
So Dawne, would you, personal question, you don't have to answer it if you don't want, but
I love personal questions.
would you identify as a person of faith or not, or atheist, agnostic, whatever?
No, I grew up going to a Methodist church, actually. My mom is a retired Methodist pastor, but she didn't become a pastor until I was older. But I mean, and it was interesting because, I didn't know if my church was conservative or not, no, there wasn't like hellfire and brimstone being preached. It was like, a bunch of nice people trying to do nice things. But it, like the way they talked about love never felt like love to me. And as soon as I could, I just stopped going. Like as soon as I was too big for my parents to like get me out of bed and dress me, I didn't have to go anymore because they had to get there. That was making them late. And so I just stopped going.
Children
And
would like to stop going to church. This is
that's how you do it. Go limp. Yeah, so no, I don't. And what's interesting actually is that it's really only been in studying this movement that I've actually heard a message of love in Christian teaching or Christian talk, it was the first time. Like there have been times I was at a training one time doing fieldwork observations, and the way that the pastor who was leading it was talking, I was like, oh, when you talk about Jesus, he sounds like a good guy. And I really had never gotten that before, really. I mean, he didn't seem sometimes terrible, like maybe he'll have to torture you forever, but sometimes, nice or whatever. But like, I had never gotten anything that felt like love at all from it. And, actually what's interesting thinking about it in terms of spiritual violence, and not just because I'm queer, but also because I grew up poor in a middle class community, and a lot of things. When we had this grant that we were applying for, there was like an American Idol audition part where we had to present our proposal in front of all of the other finalists for this grant, and this board of like 12 people.
You're saying
and
melody.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, bad joke. Really bad joke.
I'm sorry, you cut out. So Theresa had laryngitis for this conference.
And I was actually vomiting. I was sick. I was like really, really sick.
There was some reason that
it was bad.
Yeah. That maybe she wasn't going to be able to actually stand in front of this room full of people and present our spiel. And so I was practicing it the night before over and over and over and over. And like the 25th time, I was like, hey, maybe suffered spiritual violence. It only took defining it, 95 times to kind of let it sink in. Like, that's why I'm actually not part of this, because I did not experience it as positive in really any way.
I mean,
and that's what I'm so fascinated by, is that people do find hope and strength and love even while they're experiencing this torment. It's really it's beautiful and terrible. I think it's really what's that word? What's that Kantian word? That oceanic feeling, it's whatever. I can't remember the word, but it's immense.
Yeah.
We'll have Elliot on the edit, like drop that word in it won't stop.
Totally.
What is Theresa?
I'm spacing it.
How did your research?
And I'm not helping, and I'm the philosopher, so sorry.
How did your research on spiritual violence, Theresa, dovetail into this LGBTQ study?
Yeah, so I had independently been working on trying to conceptualize this term, actually after reading testimony from clergy sexual abuse survivors, and the spiritual violence that they were naming that was going kind of under discussed and underappreciated and theorized. And so I was really thinking through what it was that they were trying to name in these contexts, in the Catholic context in particular, but recognizing that some of my own experience is not with that, but as a woman in a community that experienced spiritual violence, that the narratives around gender and sexuality that were sort of generating these different forms of spiritual violence, that somehow these different forms were sort of unified in a certain way by a narrative around gender and sexuality that played itself out differently for differently situated people. And so I saw this happening to queer people in my own community as well, and seeing these connections. And then when Dawne and I began talking and began thinking about this as something I really, really wanted to explore that I hadn't done, and was able, to be able to pursue with her in this other context. So.
Yeah. And a significant part of your focus seems to be on the experiences of conservative LGBTQ Christians, which to some of our listeners might sound like an oxymoron. So, like, how many such people are there, and why did you choose to focus your research there?
Well, estimates of how many people are gay, how many people are trans, right? Like, all of those numbers there's not like a direct count, right? Because it's going to vary depending on like who's going to say yes when a stranger asks them if they're gay, or if they're bi, or if they're non-binary, right? And who is going to check that box when given that question, like, what is your sexual orientation? But so like estimates for the US population as a whole put like LGBT, I think, people at 4 to 4.5% of the population. And there's no reason to think that people who might in some ways fit into that category wouldn't also be evangelical, And so, like, if you have that feeling, but you don't want to be that, and that's not your identity, and you're told that claiming that as an identity sets you apart from God and is you turning your back on God, then you're not going to say, I'm that, because you think that's sinful, right? But then you're going to have those feelings, right? I mean, and the reason to focus on them now is, in a progressive church or even in a liberal affirming church, it's a non-issue in a lot of situations. It's just like, great, I mean, and there are lots of churches now where the bishop is gay or the pastor is gay or they do same-sex weddings all the time, and it's not the kind of issue that it is in this evangelical movement. I mean, and what's amazing to me is that this movement has been building, for decades, and is still growing, and is reaching out and like giving love to people who are really feeling not just unloved, but that their capacity to love is damaged, and that their love is harmful to the people that they love, so they should not do it. And anybody they really care about, they should get as far away from as possible, because there's something so fundamentally broken about them that they should really not love anyone until they fix themselves. And like, that's a really important dynamic to be looking at, and a lot of really powerful testimony comes out of that experience that sheds light for all of us about what it means to give and receive love, what it means to be a relational creature, which as a sociologist, I would say all human beings are. And I think there's a lot of Christian teaching that supports that too. And so I think it's a really important group to look at, because not just because of their own experience and how they're navigating this impossible situation, and because of what they make so obvious or more obvious that is true for a lot of people. That's true for in a lot of situations.
And I'll just add to that. I don't have any scientific or quantitative number, but when Dawne and I were doing participant observation at some of the organizations annual conferences that we attended, they were numbered in the thousands. I mean, these were huge conferences that were serving a need, and where people were coming together under some description of what we were talking about and interested in learning about. Yeah, and I'll just also add to the point about the broader lessons and I don't want to lessons from the things that we've learned, but including to broader social justice movements that are more secular in their orientation, because there's so much I think really beautiful and important to learn about how in how this population is navigating these spaces that just has broader import for how to do just justice work, the work of justice rooted in radical love and radical inclusion. So it's just got it's very fruitful, and for all kinds of things, I think.
Dawne, you mentioned that you've been researching this in some way, shape, or form since the 90s, you said earlier. Between here, 2021, and the 90s, there has been, in my observation, as someone who grew up in the church, has pastored for 15 years, there's been an immense change. But can you speak to what you've seen in the church as far as churches moving towards affirming and affirming churches popping up left and right? Like, have you seen that, or is that just me?
No, I think that is what's happening. And I think it's been happening. I think there's a lot of kind of big historical changes that are going on that are making that manifest, in what we see when we look at the world, like that there's more representation of different kinds of LGBTQ people means that it's easier to find role models earlier on, and easier to see that this is a thing, and easier to have friendships, with people who are out and who have never had any reason to question that they're good and that they're fine and that they're, whatever problems they have are no different than anybody else's problems, and also I think, a lot of cisgender heterosexual people are, just sort of accepting LGBTQ people as normal. And so that, like that's happening in churches too. And I mean, there's like a demographic issue where people, younger people, even millennials, have friends who are LGBTQ, and they don't want to be part of a community that is hurtful to their friends, and so like that change is happening, and that's how it happens. It always happens through relationship. I mean, it happens through policy as well. Once same-sex marriage, it was really when same-sex marriage became law of the land in 2015, that is when all of a sudden, there needed to be a new a new group of people to pick on. And so trans people became a problem that before that, I mean, there are people in our research who've been around, and like very prominent evangelicals who have noted that before 2015, asking a room full of evangelical pastors like what the Bible had to say about trans people, they would have been like, nothing. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's a thing. And then all of a sudden in 2015, trans people became the problem because gay people couldn't be the problem anymore. And so, like it's, I mean, really, it's a way that this normalization, it's kind of the ugly side of normalization, is that then there's someone else that then gets pushed out to the side and picked on. But yeah, I think that change is happening, and I think it's happening because relationships are more possible, because more people are out, but also because policies are changing.
Yep. And I mean, well, I swim in circles with lots of evangelical pastors, and I can tell you, unfortunately, gay people are still a problem for many of them. And you know that because you talk to many, it sounds like. But I hope all of our listeners are listening to the words that Dawne is using. But I hope in particular our non-affirming friends who maybe are wrestling with this are listening to the words that Dawne is using. Words and phrases like lesbian people or gay or lesbian people feeling normal, inferring that in the church, many gay and lesbian people feel abnormal or told you're abnormal, or that feeling like you're good. Like, what's the opposite of that? Growing up in a church environment where you're centered around this higher power who says you're bad inherently because of your orientation, because of something that just is natural to you. I hope you're listening to these words and taking them in and listening from the perspective of somebody other than you. Go ahead, Kyle.
All right. Was the word you were trying to think of sublime by any chance?
Yeah. That was the
there
word.
it is.
Yeah,
There it
got it.
Say sublime, and then Elliot will get it in. I'm kidding.
So let's dig into the work a little bit then. So in one of your papers, maybe more than one, you coin a phrase, sacramental shame. So I'm hoping you can describe what that is and what role it plays in the populations that you have observed and studied. And why is it important to you? Why did you write about it?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
No, you should start. Yeah, because you started yeah.
Okay. Well, it was hearing people's testimony, reading, thinking of sacrament as, I mean, different churches define that differently, but as a tangible sign of the presence of the divine. And in some people's traditions, it's necessary for salvation. And that's a sacrament, right? And as I was reading and hearing people tell their stories, it really started to seem like shame like a performance and an avowal of shame constantly was being treated almost like a sacrament for LGBTQ people. That if you aren't constantly proving that you hate this about yourself, that you're trying to get rid of it, that you're trying to fix it, then you've turned your back on God, or you're identifying with your sin. And so, just this need to like constantly be, beseeching God to change you and testifying to that and accepting that you have different rules than everyone else. That, we talked to one person who was in a welcoming but not affirming church where it was okay for him to be a member if he was gay, and it was okay for him to be a worship leader and teach classes and whatever. But he would be called in all the time for these things that nobody else would ever be called in for. Like one time he got called in to we need to meet with the senior pastor because someone had seen him in a restaurant with a man. And they're like, someone saw you on a date, and if you're dating, you can't be teaching and you can't be leading worship, because that's part of your deal with us, is that you can't be practicing gayness or whatever, you can't be a practicing homosexual. And he's like, so what do you mean I can't be on a date? Like, am I allowed to go out and have a nice time with another person? Can I only go out in groups? Do I have to be alone all the time? Like, can heterosexuals who are not married eat in restaurants together? And that if he wasn't constant, even in a welcoming church, if he wasn't constantly displaying shame and like this, that like he needed to deny himself regular stuff like eating in a restaurant, then he was in trouble, then he was not right with God. And so it just started to seem like these constant displays of shame. And usually it wasn't in a welcoming church. Often it was in a community where it's like, you can't do anything except, let us try and fix you because you're broken, and you can't try to be like Jesus until you fix this. And so it really started to seem like that shame was the only thing that would indicate to everybody else in the community that this person had not turned their back on God, that this person was trying to get right with God. Mm-hmm. And when we asked people about it, like, it's kind of seeming like this. It kind of seems like, like a couple people, like, people with, 3 masters in divinity, theology, and something else, might be like, well, I think a sacrament is different in this way or that way. But a lot of people were like, fundamentally, yeah, yes, that is it. That's what's going on. And for me as a sociologist, that the only way that I know that I'm really understanding what's going on is if it makes sense, if my description of people's experience sounds right to them. So that's kind of where that came from. I mean, that's not kind of where it came from. It is exactly where it came from. Mm-hmm. Trying not to do that that thing where you pretend you're not really saying what you're saying. I am saying that. That's where it came from.
Theresa, anything to add?
Not to the point about sacrament, but I'll just to elaborate about maybe the shame part. Shame is an emotion that signals fear of or the idea that you are unworthy, that there is some unworthiness for belonging or for relationship or for connection. And so to make shame, chronic shame, right? This isn't episodic shame, but to make chronic shame become the disposition, the orientation that a person has to take as a condition for relationship is really, I'll just say, perverse. I mean, to make an emotion that is about unworthiness for relationship the condition for obviously conditional belonging in relationship is so harmful. And we've seen the harm play out. So to make it sacred then on top of that, right? So I think it's an abusive dynamic, and then to try to make it holy or sacred and connect it to God.
Yeah. So I just want to frame up that phrase a little bit more for our listeners, because that is a powerful couple of words you put together there, Dawne. Sacramental shame. When I hear that word, I just think a sacrament is the means, the thing that brings about God's grace in the divine presence, like you're saying, Dawne. Mm-hmm. So for in non-affirming evangelical churches, conservative churches, the thing that brings about the presence and grace of God in a person's life is shame about who they are. That's what you're saying.
And feeling that they're unworthy of relationship with God.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's this impossible,
Mhm.
like, this is what causes, I mean, not just psychological trauma, but sometimes even health problems, is this completely impossible position. Like, you are only acceptable to God to the extent that you know that you are absolutely unacceptable to God.
Yep.
Mhm.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope you listeners just push pause on your phone right now and just sit with that for a minute and then come back to us.
So you note in one of your papers that there's a sharp difference between the way that shame is experienced, as Theresa put it, episodically versus dispositionally, but like a sharp difference between the way that it's experienced by a straight cis Christian, for example, versus how it's experienced by LGBTQ Christians. And you even acknowledge that in some instances, feeling shame over wrongdoing can actually lead to virtue, but that's disallowed in the case of the LGBTQ Christian. Can you say a little bit about how it's different?
You want to start, Theresa?
Well, I think, I mean, when your community, when your faith community automatically and by default and without even having to say anything, when you feel like you can show up as a flawed person, but a person, right? Then, and you're not living with a disposition of shame, that your personhood and your worthiness are just constantly in question as a person, not necessarily as a person that makes mistakes or a person that fails, but you can just show up and belong, then when you do break relationships with people, when you do mess up, when you do fall, and you experience shame as an emotion that episodically responds to the reality that you broke a relationship or you damaged a relationship or you harmed a relationship that you care about, that's a very different experience than being in a dynamic where you're actively shamed routinely and chronically for your capacity to be in relationship, right? So there's a difference between feeling shame in response to misuse of your capacity for relationship and being chronically shamed for your capacity, for the capacity itself, is sort of saying you're not fit for relationship. So that's one important difference. However, I do think that with respect to gender and sexuality, there's probably a lot of shame going on, a lot of a lot of shame for a lot of people. I'm in a different context. I'm coming from a Catholic context, but I think sex and sexuality itself, especially for women, but it was for a long time. I was in a faith formation situation as a child in a community where it was taboo, unpleasant. You're not supposed to talk about it. It's not, and then of course this long history in the church of attributing sexual sinfulness to women. And if anything does go wrong, it's my fault, and internalizing a lot of that. So I think that there's plenty of shame to go around these issues in particular. But I think there's a real difference between being taught that you're failing to live up to a standard of who God made you to be and being taught that you're somehow outside of that altogether, that your that your personhood is questioned because of the experiences, how you experience yourself and how you experience intimacy and human connection.
And love
That's
it.
where I'd start.
Like you say, I jotted down a quote here from your Sunsets in Solidarity paper. You say, not feeling loved by those who appear so clearly loving can compound the feeling that something is wrong with the person's capacity to give and receive love. They must get it, and they think I'm not. So
yeah. And especially when it's coming from people that you do have close relationship with, right? That you had trusted, affectionate, close relationships with as friends or family members, right? That you would say, I believe that you love me and this doesn't feel like love. Man, I must really be messed up. You're right. I am really damaged. The toxicity of that and the way it's internalized in people. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of times, like if you think about parents, like a healthy parent-child relationship, whatever, the kid comes out as gay, say. I'm thinking of a particular example. And and actually, and you could find this testimony. There's a website called Just Because He Breathes, where these parents, Rob and Linda Robertson, talk about when their child came out to them. They were, evangelical, devout family. And the way and they tell their story, which ended tragically, because they want to spare other parents from having this experience and other kids from having Ryan's experience. And you see these, like, this loving, big, wonderful family. And the minute Ryan came out to them, he became a problem that had to be fixed. And the whole family's like they had binders of Bible passages in the bathroom so that no moment would go without praying for Ryan to change. And he was memorizing scriptures, and he was giving his testimony in front of 100 people. And he was signed up for guitar lessons with manly role models, who would teach him proper manhood. And it didn't work. And he ended up running away when he was 17 and being gone for 18 months. And they didn't know if he was dead or alive. And he was, developed addictions. And it was a terrible situation. And in their testimony, you can see that, like, they had a relationship. And he tried so hard to be worthy of that relationship when to them, they all of a sudden he became a problem to them. And, they had to fix him, and he had to fix himself to try and go back to having a relationship again. They didn't think they weren't having a relationship. They thought they were just trying to, like, fix a problem, but they actually stopped listening to him and stopped learning from him when he said he was gay. All of a sudden he became a different thing, right? And that, like, that intimate connection that they had as, a loving family became this, like, you're an it now, we have to fix you. But it doesn't seem like it because they're so loving and they're trying so hard to make everything okay. It looks like love, but it didn't feel like love, because when he called them finally after 18 months, he said, like, can you ever love me again? And they're like, we never stopped loving you. But he didn't feel loved, right? He didn't feel loved in that, because they weren't listening to him. They weren't learning from him. They were trying to fix him, meaning trying to make him conform to their idea about what a good Christian boy would look like.
Yeah. So can I ask 2 follow-up questions? Well, one might be an observation. The other is a question, Dawne. I want to, like, our listeners to be making this connection between what we hear from conservative Christian leaders. And by conservative, I don't mean politically, I mean theologically. I mean, I'm thinking back to watching a YouTube video of John MacArthur, who is a giant in the conservative evangelical world, telling parents who wrote into him, who said, my son came out as gay, what do I do? And he said, very simply, shun him. Like, this is love. This is what love looks like. This is to address the sin in his life. You shun him and pray for the Holy Spirit to bring him back and to get him to repent. Next question. And it's really easy to create sound bites, theological, doctrinal sound bites that we just reduce all of these experiences down to these doctrinal sound bites that makes it sound very easy, neat, black and white, very, very friendly. And then you hear a story like this, where the actual reality of shun them or pray the gay out or just do everything, all this stuff, actually rips a person's identity and who they are right out of their body, out of their felt experience. And this is what happens. So this is really, really important. I think this is a gap for many Christians who've been given soundbite after soundbite doctrinally and said that, well, this is why it's a sin. This is what you do. It's very simple, right? And then you hear a story and it gets very, very complex and very, very painful, heart-wrenching, a lot of things that our Jesus stands against and preaches against. So it's never easy when you hear personal stories. And then, Dawne, I wrestle with this because in some little way, and I feel dirty even saying this a little bit, but in some little way, I do feel sympathy for his name was Ryan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for Ryan's parents, in
Yes.
that I do really believe them when they say we never stopped loving you. Like, I think
Mhm.
their idea of love and
Mhm.
like their way of loving Ryan at that point was doing what they felt like they were doing what they were supposed to do in order to be fully loving.
Mhm.
That's a
Mhm.
Yeah.
a really hard thing to
Yeah.
get around when your idea of how to love makes that person feel unloving. And then I know there are people who are listening who are thinking, well, is it unloving when I tell my alcoholic dad to stop drinking and take all his booze bottles? That's the argument that we use. Is it unloving to tell my daughter who's whatever? There's tons of scenarios that Christians are really good at saying, to say this is what love looks like. But we need to let's just stop that argument and hear what you have to say about that argument, Dawne.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that argument I've been hearing that argument for decades now because I'm an old person, I guess. And I mean, and it's actually thought of this earlier when we were talking about, how shame can be redemptive. A lot of times people say, well, maybe I want to cheat on my wife, but, I can't. And I have my shame about that is what makes me not cheat on my wife. And so that makes me a better person. But, when you're talking about things that break relationship, right? When you're talking about who someone is in terms of gender or sexuality, you're talking about their capacity to create a relationship with anybody at all, not just a sexual relationship, but to relate to other people at all, like a sense of who they are. And the only way to get that, it's a metaphor. It doesn't seem like a metaphor, I know. And I just want to put out there right now before I forget, I agree with you completely. My heart is broken for Rob and Linda Robertson. They share their testimony because their hearts are broken and they want to spare other people from that experience. And people will be like, you suck, you're the worst parents in the world, like, and I'm making little typey fingers, like that's the those are the comments that they get on their website. And I mean, they know that. They don't need anybody to tell them that. And yeah, they wanted to spend eternity in heaven with Ryan, and they wanted him to be able to get there with with them. And so, yeah, but the problem is that there is such a thing as sexual orientation, and there is such a thing as gender identity. And if your sexual orientation and your gender identity fit the story of your community about what you're supposed to be like, then it's smooth sailing. Obviously there's ups and downs, and life is hard for everybody, blah blah blah. But at fundamentally, you're starting from an okay place. You're a person like the rest of us. The problem is that the idea that that homosexuality, any kind of sexual orientation diversity, any kind of experience of gender that is other than, like the sort of, the two kinds of people sort of polarized by binary story, that story leads being LGBTQ to seem like a sin akin to murder, akin to cheating on your wife, akin to stealing from your business, whatever. And but those things all break relationship. I was interviewing somebody back in the 90s, and she was like, and like, that's what sin is. Sin hurts people. And, if my brother were to be gay, that would hurt people. And I was like, oh, okay, how? Like, how does it hurt people? And, she said, well, my father would be really hurt because, he's homophobic, basically, and she got stuck, right? Like, there's this narrative that sins hurt people, being LGBTQ is a sin, therefore it hurts people. but it doesn't actually. It does not break relationship in itself. Other people break the relationship and then blame it on the fact that this person has expressed this difference. And if you actually listen in a relational way without being like, oh, well, whatever you say is wrong and evil and the devil's got you and we got to fix you because we want to spend heaven forever with you, then you're not relating to them anymore. But when you really relate to them and listen, then you understand that they're not making this up. They're not, like giving themselves over to sin. They're not turning their back on God. Like, this is their capacity to relate to other people. And then when you say like that is actually worse than murder because murderers can be forgiven, like then you're really putting people in a unlivable place.
Yeah. Theresa, anything you want to add there?
I would just add that to the analogy, I don't think that everything that Dawne said, and I think that, the alcoholic isn't shunned. Shunning is, this is different. They're not, the alleged sins are not treated the same. And I also think part of what's interesting to me, two things. One is a really narrow definition of sexuality when you're attributing sinful sexuality to other people. You want to have this broad understanding of sexuality is really central to intimate human connection when you're talking about it in the framework of kind of heteronormative binary gender that is compatible with your worldview. But the minute that, in a broad sense of really foundational for relationship, but when you want to attribute sexual sinfulness, it suddenly becomes a lot narrower. It becomes about, narrow activity or, desires that are, sexual or carnal in nature and really so that's the first. And the second thing that's always been really interesting to me is I'm really interested in understanding the fear and the panic. Like no other sins evoke this kind of fear, alleged sin. This is not sinful. No other activity that's defined as sinful provokes this kind of fear and panic. And I think that pursuing and trying to understand what are people so afraid of? What is at stake? What is really at the root of the fear and panic around this alleged, way of deviating? When again, we've had people who really were taught that, yeah, murder's forgivable, but this isn't. Like, what is it about this?
So what, Theresa, what is it about it?
Well, I mean, one explanation that we pursue that I think has some plausibility is that binary gender and sexuality are intimately tied to recognitions of personhood in this community. And so people don't come right out and say that, but I think people who experience expansive ways of experiencing human connection and expansive ways of experiencing gender appear as threatening to that narrative that is a theological anthropology. And I'm no theologian, but an anthropology, a kind of conception of what the created order, is supposed to be, what personhood is. And so they don't appear as persons. And there's something really, I actually think it's rooted in power and fear of giving up security and stability and a framework of understanding and worldview that makes sense and a lot of people's identities are rooted in ultimately. But I think it's connected to this an anthropology that implicitly makes binary gender essential to personhood from a particular worldview. And so people don't appear as persons. And then that's just like the word is used, abomination, right? So, yeah.
Just for who aren't familiar, maybe just describe what you have in mind when you refer to that kind of anthropology, what it's based in, and the title of one of your papers actually references this idea, right? The idea of the sunset versus the binary anthropology that you're talking about. So can you maybe describe just a little bit for listeners who may not be familiar?
Dawne wanted to chime in and maybe
I think this will answer your question. What became clear to us is that like when someone grew up knowing that, a murderer could be forgiven, but not a gay person. It really makes clear that, in effect, a lot of these churches are treating this binary conception of gender, God created male and female, as a commandment that is actually more important than the 10 Commandments and came before the 10 Commandments. And if you read things like coming out of the Southern Baptist Convention and things like that, there's this concern that without a binary conception of gender, there's no need for redemption. There's no such thing as sin. Like, everything will fall apart because God created male and female, right? But it doesn't actually say that. It says, male and female, he created them. But it says, God created the, talking Genesis 1, it says, God created the heavens and earth and sea and dry land. And, there are all of these distinctions that, this very poetic description of like where this all came from, that, no one says like, like it mentions creatures of the air and the sea and the dry land, but like no one says amphibians are a problem. No one, says that I guess someone must say that like the platypus is an abomination, but it's, like they're not going out to kill them all. It exists. We accept that. The reason sunsets appear in the title is because, like people have brought up the point that, God created day and night in Genesis 1, but no one thinks that these in-between times of sunrise and sunset are abominable times. You should go hide in your basement until it's over so you never see this in between time. Like, it's not an abomination. It's beautiful, right? It's people feel closest to God standing on the shore in the space where you can't draw the line between sea and dry land and looking at the sunrise. Like that is sublime, right? Like, that is beautiful, and that is where people feel the presence of the divine. But then when it comes to gender, it's like, no, two kinds of people, that's it. Men and women, they complete each other. And without that, you have nothing. Like, there's no need for love. There's no need for redemption. There's no need for salvation. There's no need for anything. We might as well all just like wither up and die, because God actually depends on us to reaffirm this commitment to binary gender that is really unique to European Christianity and was imported around the world in the moment of colonization, right? Where societies all around the world recognized that some people are born not distinctly male or female, and that some people feel different ways, and having that like societies all around the world, thousands of societies just in the Americas, had some kind of intermediate role that people could fill if they felt called to it. And, that was one of the first things European settlers worked to eradicate by like throwing those people into pits to be eaten alive by dogs, and used that as a justification for stealing their land, saying this is terra nullius, this is no one's land, because these people aren't people, because they don't recognize our binary understanding of gender, right? And our conception of male as superior to female, and these two incomplete parts that go together, right? That whole narrative is propped up, and that itself becomes a commandment almost. You have to, God will be threatened, right? Unless you support this fiction that men and women are opposites, that they're from different planets, and that they're incomplete without each other.
Oh man.
And okay.
Dawne, just so you know, what you're doing right now for many people, many listeners, is undoing years of fundamentalist, preachers who were ranting kind of similarly to you were a little bit, like passionately, but ranting in the opposite way with like really bad arguments, both theologically and anthropologically, you're undoing so much of that. I can feel the relief of our listeners as they listen, and the jaw
Hope so.
floor when you talk about sunrises and sunsets.
That or they turned it off 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, I hope not. Come on, listen, stick with us. You don't have to agree. Just listen, stick with us.
I mean, hopefully this contextualizes and explains a bit why when a well-meaning, sincere, conservative Christian tries to have a conversation about gender identity and the LGBTQ person says, why would I want to have a conversation where you question my existence?
Mm-hmm.
And the person trying to have the conversation says, what are you talking about? I'm just trying to have a good faith conversation here. Are you not willing to consider the evidence? Hopefully this contextualizes what's happening there psychologically. Yep. There's a background to this. It's not just a thing that we just thought of and brought up.
Yep. And I want to say though, I literally thank God for my gay friends who are willing to sit in that excruciating place that I asked them to sit in as a naive, ignorant, young adult who was non-affirming and conservative Christian, because the night my perspective changed on all of this regarding sexuality, the night my journey began towards loving and affirming LGBTQ plus human beings, was over drinks with my friend Brad, who was gay and who just let me ask really dehumanizing questions, even, and really stupid questions. And he just sat there and answered each and every one. And my world changed in that 2-hour conversation. So I completely affirm the right of LGBTQ people to say, I can't sit in this space. I can't let you ask those questions. But I want to say thank you to the ones who have, because you are literally changing so much, changed my life.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to say quickly that we've talked to people who are allied in this in these communities we're learning from too, that have had very similar experiences, friendships or relationships that they could no longer keep going in the way they were going, with realizing they were harming their friend.
Yeah. How are you guys doing on time? We been talking for about an hour. Got a couple more questions I'd like to bring up, but I want to honor your time.
I'm good.
Yeah, I can do a couple more questions.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
You're a fun bunch.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't ask you. Are you guys drinking anything you'd want to tell us?
Yes.
This is the theme of our podcast. We try to share what we're drinking with each other.
What are you drinking? It looks like water.
Oh, this is
that's gin. That's how they fool people. What are you drinking?
What is this, Evan Williams?
This is Evan Williams. This is the swill before our tasting that we do.
But what's the real bottle there?
Oppidan. I'm going to have to research it after the interview, ladies, so I can actually properly say it, because I don't even think that was correct. But this is from some friends who supply us with delicious beverages, and we tell people to go purchase them.
Yeah, it's the main reason
nice.
to do a podcast, to be honest.
Some more swill to hold you open.
Hey, we should do a podcast and get free booze.
I know, get free booze.
Yes, I'm drinking a fine Guinness Stout with the toucan on the can.
Good can.
It is.
Yeah, it's a good can. Yeah.
I'm drinking Four Roses bourbon.
Oh,
I like bourbon. Yeah.
Cheers, girl.
So, cheers. But it's in a coffee mug, and that's a long story. But anyway, that talks about strong women needing coffee, but I've got booze in it. So.
And really, that's just left over from your breakfast, right?
Correct. I mean, this is with me all day. Yeah, no.
Reverence, Dr. Tobin, when I said cheers, girl. So I take that back.
Oh, hey. You know what? It's all good.
Good. All right.
All good.
We featured a Four Roses on the podcast previously. It's good stuff. Yeah. Okay. So a couple more questions here. Can you talk a little bit about gender complementarity or complementarianism, however you want to put it, and how that undergirds, in your view, heteronormativity? So maybe just define those big words and explain their connection, because I'm thinking we probably have some listeners who, in fact, I know we have some listeners, I can name them, who who definitely think that they are egalitarian and not complementarian. And they're not affirming of LGBTQ people, and they don't probably sense any tension in that at all. So can you tell me what you think the connection is between heteronormativity and gender complementarity?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way we use the term is the way that we hear people talk about it, like at these conferences that we've been going to, et cetera, is the idea that God created two different kinds of people to complete each other,
As
and
opposites.
yes, two opposites, complete, yeah, and of course hierarchically they're not just, but they're hierarchical. And heteronormativity it's a word that came around, I want to say in the early 90s, to replace the concept of homophobia, because there are people who believe that homosexuality is sinful who aren't afraid necessarily. It's not a clinical phobia like agoraphobia or arachnophobia or something. It's that it's a conception of what is not just normal but normative. But those are related, right? The idea that things are only good or people are only good if they're normal, right, is part of it, which I think is the main kind of ethical flaw, if I can use that language, because that is not really a great basis for human rights or whatever. But the idea that heterosexuality is not just normative, like what should happen, how things should be, but also that it is just what is, right, and what has always been, and what happens in animals, and just this idea that heterosexuality is this timeless universal. And so they relate to each other, because if you think of heterosexuality as male-female marriage, then complementarity is male-female marriage. Males and females complete each other in marriage. And so, yeah, like the idea that, like people talk about how like animals are all heterosexual, or, like animals have XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes or whatever, when actually a lot of animals have like W and Z chromosomes. They don't have the same chromosomes. They're not like us. Or animals have all kinds of ways. Like there's animals that their eyeball moves across their head. Like there's all kind that it's an allegory to try and make heterosexuality seem like it just comes from God and nature and everything, and any deviation from that is sick, wrong, evil, illegal, whatever. And just to put it out there, like the concept of heterosexuality, that some people are defined by an attraction to people of a different sex from them, like that only came about in the late 19th century, right? Like before that, marriage was about like you have obligations to get married in these ways, but it wasn't about like your attractions defining who you are as a person. Now I'm told that heterosexuals really feel like they're heterosexual, and that their attractions define who they are, but that hasn't always been. That's not the way it's always been. It's actually a fairly new understanding, right? I mean, and it goes along with the idea that the word homosexual wasn't in the Bible until 1947, right? With the translation of the Revised Standard Version, I think, if I'm remembering that correctly. Like these are not, like, we think, because they're so pervasive in our lives and our thinking, that all this is new. But actually, heterosexuality and heteronormativity, the idea that heterosexuality alone is natural and good and true and of God and all that, that's actually new.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that the way that this narrative of binary gender operates is to build heterosexuality into gender, right? So that what it means to be a real woman is to be heterosexual, meaning have these attractions to the opposite sex, and vice versa. And then there's all kinds of narratives about what that means and how that plays out femininely and masculinely. And one of the ways we saw this playing out was when we interviewed people who were trying to disclose their being gay for instance, I'm thinking of one person who, many people gave stories about how their communities tried to fix their sexuality with gendered behavior, right? So in the story about Ryan, or in other stories we heard, a woman coming out as lesbian, trying to say, look, this is just who I am. And her community saying, you got to put on tighter jeans, and we got to learn to shake your hips. And I couldn't wear vests, and I couldn't play softball. Like all of this gendered behavior. What's wrong is your gender. We got to get you gender corrected so that your sexuality will come into align with that. So this kind of alignment of sexuality and gender that's in this narrative as well. So that to be a certain gender and to perform it means to have a certain kind of sexuality. So it's connected in that way. And I would ask a question. I'm puzzled by I think it's use of terms, but I would like to understand how people, what they mean when they say they are egalitarian and non-affirming. Because I think maybe I would use those terms. To me, I have trouble holding those terms together. So I think I maybe don't know how they're using them.
Typically, at least in the context I've experienced these terms being used the most, egalitarian has to do more with women's role in the church and in marriage specifically. So women can be ordained or be an elder or something like that if you're egalitarian, but not if you're complementarian. And it's a kind of, I see it as a mark of privilege personally, but it's a kind of easy bifurcation between that and, look, the LGBT thing is a totally separate issue. Let's consider each on its own merits. So we can pretend to be really progressive because we let women be on our boards and stuff.
I see.
But and maybe we even welcome the gay people insofar as they can't have any leadership roles or something. But we don't see any tension in that. There's no contradiction there because they're fundamentally separate issues because we haven't thought deeply about what gender is.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Honestly, I would have held that position, egalitarian, non-affirming, until not so long ago. Didn't see any problem with it, really. The only way that I saw them as related was that they were related to, they both fall under the camp of progressive Christianity. I know that I knew that I was a little bit of a progressive Christian because I was egalitarian and strongly egalitarian. But similar to sexuality, in that if you're affirming, you're quite progressive in your faith, in your Christianity. But that would be the only way I would have related them or thought of them together. I would have had no problem and would have argued with you that you can't be one without the other.
Yeah.
And I would still argue with you that you can't be one without the other because I was that for a long time.
Oh, sure. As a descriptive fact. So it's almost like you have the complementarian thing, which is hierarchical, and so the egalitarian and a lot of these progressive evangelical spaces have made it horizontal, right? It's no longer hierarchical, and we feel real good about that. But we haven't actually, so it's still a binary, right? And
got it. Yeah.
Binary,
yeah.
But
and all the baggage that comes with that in some way. Yeah.
Down.
Yeah,
we're not allowed to go that far.
And where I think the moment where it dawned on me that they were related was literally as I was preaching a sermon several years ago. We're privileged to have a decent amount of LGBTQ plus community in our church, and as I'm preaching a sermon about women in the church, actually about women's roles in the church, I made the statement that I don't remember exactly what I said, but I just basically made the statement: if you were to tell me a person who's a preacher, and I experienced a lot of life by preaching, writing sermons, delivering them, getting people emotionally invested and spiritually alive. If you were to tell me that I can't do this because of my gender, because I'm a man, I can't actually do this, I would walk away from the faith. I couldn't do it like that. I couldn't. And as I said it, I looked at a gay man who was listening to me, and I was like, I got some thinking to do here. And then it dawned on me.
Right. That it's like telling someone if you can't love this person because you're a man.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm done, and Randy can ask any follow-ups. You talk quite a bit about humility and its connection with pride. And there is a long-standing tradition going back at least to C.S. Lewis, but I know much further, of thinking of pride as it's not just a sin, it's the source of all sin. It's the meta-sin. It's just another way of describing the break with God. It's the root of the whole thing. And that is very deeply ingrained in evangelicalism. It's still difficult for me to think differently, really. And humility, of course, being the opposite of pride, what Jesus is like. And but then again, you have a community who has defined itself in many ways with that label, pride. And so you talk a bit about differentiating what Christians, particularly conservative Christians, mean by pride versus what LGBTQ people mean by it, and consequently what you think humility actually is as a virtue. So can you talk a bit about those terms and what you think humility looks like?
Do you want to start, Dawne?
I mean, I feel like this is your
Oh.
wheelhouse.
I don't know about that.
I think it was your brilliant insight.
I think it was our participants' brilliant insight, but I think so. The equation, or the defining pride as hubris, basically, right? As a vice, and as, I guess, the vice of all vices. When we were talking to people who had experienced chronic dispositional shaming, and then they were on top of that told actually that they were arrogant, that this was the sin of pride, the sin of hubris, to try and name who they were, to try to name that they were somehow elevating their sexual identity or their gender identity above God or above their identity as Christian. They were told that they actually couldn't be both Christian and who they said they were. And then so that, that the sort of, that was used as part of the weaponry to continue the shaming dynamic. And so many of them felt really cut off from being able to simply just affirm their basic worth and goodness as people created in God's image. Like, that was fundamentally cut off. And so we were noticing that on the one hand. On the other hand, and people saying, like, that this was harming them, they were being charged with arrogance and the sin of hubris. On the other hand, a lot of people think that shame and humility are connected, because they think that, shame, if you're vulnerable to feeling shame, then it indicates that you're liable to humility, that you're open to being affected by other people's experiences of you, and being open to having people point out to you that you're flawed in some way or that you hurt them in some way. So it's a sort of indication of your humility. But for people who are chronically shamed, shame in that sense, chronic dispositional shame, doesn't teach humility. It teaches self-abasement. It teaches self-abnegation. It teaches self-loathing. And so you've got people who have learned from their churches what we would call, and in some places we do call, vices of deficiency, right? This idea that they're fundamentally unworthy. And then on top of that, being told that they're arrogant for trying to just name a simple descriptive truth about who they experience themselves to be. So that the whole mechanism of virtue and Christian vice is operationalized as part of the sort of shaming and dynamic that keeps people, breaks people and leads to these toxic effects. So in our experiences talking to people, the thing over and over and over again that helped people heal, helped people experience a way out, a way forward, was a recognition of their own value and worth as human beings. And it often came from community or relationship with other queer people, like meeting other queer people and saying, wait, you exist, you're human, you're good, I see you, that means I exist, I can exist in the world. So finding and affirming the humanity in other people who were like them enabled them to affirm just their own basic humanity and goodness. And so it was a sense of worthiness and basic sense of confidence in my worthiness as a human that was achieved in relationship. So it was in a relational experience of basic worth, not an elevating of self over other people or over God. And this book by Elizabeth Edmond, it's called Queer Virtue. She's an Episcopalian priest, really began to articulate this idea of relational pride that we were seeing, and one of the most, I think, powerful stories or things that we heard over and over again was very often the person on the other side, also, if it wasn't other queer people they were hearing affirming messages from about their own basic worthiness, was God in their own prayer life. So very, very often, I mean, they have their whole community telling them that it's worse than murder, and they're going to God over and over again. It's submission to God. It was the most beautiful act of humility in that sense, in the Christian sense of submission to God's will, and over in their prayer lives, experiencing God saying, be who I made you to be. I love you. And then choosing eventually to trust that inner knowledge and that inner connection with God. So that, and meeting other queer people and finding that it was these relationships with the divine and with other people that was instilling in them a basic sense of their own humanity. This was a different kind of pride. It was not hubris. And that if anybody thinks that they have the market on what pride is, there was something else going on here that's really important to human relationships, that this kind of pride is essential to relationship. And we were beginning to see that it was the other side of virtuous humility, which wasn't just about a self-oriented virtue where people can kind of own their limitations and own their weaknesses, but was really about people. And you see this in a lot of the stories of parents or allies that eventually kind of have conversions or have their hearts changed. It was because they prioritized relationship. It was the relationship, again, that enabled people to open up to listening and loving their child or their friend, and saying, okay, I'm not going to choose allegiance to a narrative over allegiance to a relationship. And it opened them up to be vulnerable. And so we began to see pride and humility as operating as two sides of a really important emotional scaffolding for genuine and authentic loving relationship, that a self has to feel worthy of relationship and has to be able to be worthy enough or have a sense of that in order to be open and vulnerable in a safe and healthy way, right? So that the vulnerability doesn't become doormat, and also a sense of worthiness doesn't become superiority or control, or right? So that these two emotional dispositions that people were naming as pride. I mean, frankly, they name it as pride, and I believe what they say, that they're experiencing a kind of pride that is absolutely critical to healing resistance and really developing, I think, radically, for me at least, new interpretations of Christian love that have made my faith richer for it. I mean, I have learned more about the love of Jesus from this community than I have in any one of my catechism classes, theology classes, or church experiences. Like my faith has been renewed because of the experiences of humility, pride in relationship, of love that these people are fostering as God's love. So that's a long answer. I'm sorry, I babble, but I am drinking Four Roses and it's 9:00 and I usually go to bed at 9. Sorry.
We found our first that we've known truly humble philosopher, and like really just like I'm kidding. But we have these sound bites that when we drop our episodes on social media, we put a sound bite in, and hopefully it's like 30 or 45 seconds or whatever, and it's enough to grab the audience and make them want to listen. I want to put that whole 6-minute explanation of pride in that whole thing that you just said. I want that to be just the sound bite right there. That was incredible. And I know our listeners, as they were listening to you talk just brilliantly, they were recognizing the work of the Spirit in what you were talking about. Because when we're talking about, and I'm speaking as a pastor now, when we're talking about the redemption of a person's humanity, when we're talking about a reclamation of a person's value and dignity and goodness and worth, when we're talking about these things, we're actually talking about the work of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. Period, for me. And so that means that perhaps, what if the pride movement, this is going to get me in trouble and we're going to have a really bad review because of this on Apple Podcast. But to me, you talking made me think, wow, was the pride movement a work of the Holy Spirit? Sounds like it, because
yes. That's what yes, I mean, that's my experience of what I mean,
in speaking to the last half of what you just said, I mean, last year, Elliot, myself, and my daughter marching in this Black Lives Matter protest down Bayview and into downtown and all that stuff, and it was put on by the LGBTQ community. We, mm-hmm. tons of trans people, tons of, gay, lesbian people. And I was reflecting with my daughter as we were walking out after like 4 hours, sweaty marching and greasy and all that stuff. And I just asking her what were her thoughts and what were her thoughts of the people that we were marching with. And she just looked at me and she said, "They really loved each other, Dad."
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
and I said, "That felt like the church, didn't it?" And I mean, again, we're talking about, if you zoomed in there and walked with us, it was very clearly the LGBTQ community. And that was just my 13-year-old daughter's easy observation. They just loved each other well. John 13, anyone? Don't know your principles by your love. Thank you, Theresa. Dawne, do you have anything there?
Well, I mean, I was actually just thinking about, what you were saying, and it's so clear to me that Black Lives Matter is a saying and a movement just so firmly rooted in love and the same kind of relational pride, like because I know you don't deserve this, I know that I don't deserve it. And when I am a white person, and when I hear other white people saying that it's hateful, it is like I mean, that fills me with shame for white people and whiteness, and how the creation of whiteness is really the opposite of love and the opposite of humility. And yes, like, I mean, any movement for justice is rooted in love, because without justice, you don't have love, but love compels you to seek justice, right? I mean, that's if love's not compelling you to seek justice, it's not love. And for us, this whole thing, like I wrote, at one point we were like working on this, book, and like getting lost in the weeds, and I finally had to just make a big sign on the bulletin board across from my desk. Wait,
show them your sign.
Yeah,
it's going to be our book cover.
Yeah. That it's all about love. Right? And it's about this like wild, beautiful, uncontained, not boxed in love. That love, grows beyond all that. And that's what's so compelling about this movement, is that, like, for me, I was just like, not doing it, see ya, and checked out of the church, to avoid what a lot of the people that we've been talking to have been through, and they're staying because of their love, right? I mean, and plenty, I mean, I have no criticism. I mean, you can also leave because of love. Like, that is not, that's not a bad thing. Like, absolutely, you can leave because of love, but the love that compels some people to stay is really just profound.
Mm-hmm. I want to, take back and apologize my joke about you, which was about Theresa.
You weren't totally wrong. Well, is there anything you want to plug? Where can people find you online? Tell us about this book you're writing. Any idea when that might be available? They're laughing.
They're laughing. Yeah.
Well, there's this little thing that happened called COVID-19, just like totally just derailed all of life's plans. But we're going to get back on track real soon.
We have a writing retreat, early June, a writing retreat. We're going to get back on it. And we did our very first virtual research poster presentation, for which I learned what a QR code was and how to develop a website. And so made one poorly, but we have one, and I don't recommend.
Infinitely better than what I have made, which is 0. Yeah.
I'm not sure I would send people to it yet.
I get made fun of so consistently from these two about my technological clumsiness and ignorance that thank you. Technological mastery.
Yeah, but we'll get there. We have a space. We just, a web space, but it's probably not ready.
Would we be able to, Dawne and Theresa, would we be able to link your articles on our show notes, if just in case someone's
Absolutely.
interested in reading them?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome.
Yeah, like, I mean, I think some of them might be like
They're-
protected
they're-
by a firewall, but we should share PDF.
There was a blog out.
Yeah.
Accessible.
Oh yeah. The blog.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And we can share PDFs probably, right? If
I got them all already.
oh, okay. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Reading them after this conversation will be so helpful, because
Yeah.
I started reading them yesterday and I was like, I don't have like 2 days to
Get
read
the
this and
method
process.
section and
Yeah.
get a little over it.
The whole goal of writing this book is to make it not
Yeah, not a method
academic,
section.
yeah,
There
to
won't
make
be a
it
method
really
section. Yeah.
Yeah.
understandable to people. Yeah, we're really striving to
You have a working title for the book?
possibly something like The Motivation to Love or something like that. That was our original
Yeah.
journal, or I mean original grant proposal.
Mhm.
And that's on this sign. That also reminds me of what we're doing. Okay, this is my high tech.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's actually right next to the thing we drew up on scrap paper and took a
Yeah.
picture of to put in a PowerPoint. Because we
Yes.
didn't know how to use like all the shapes and things in PowerPoint. So I'm
That
getting
was a high
better.
point. That was a high point of that was good. Yeah.
I've moved way beyond like chalk and blackboard, so I'm feeling super high tech.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining this. This has
Yes.
been delightful and really important and honestly moving at times.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
can't wait to read the book whenever it does come out. When it does,
It
maybe.
will.
It will. It's coming out. Yeah. Thank you for for inviting us and for your patience as we figured out how to schedule it.
No worries.
No, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, and yeah, thanks for this conversation. It's been a
Mhm.
pleasure.
awesome.
Cool.